Mr. Speaker.
Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continued help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Justice Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the West Gallery, I would like to welcome and introduce guests from Hope Restored Canada. Here, here. Jolene McGill is the Executive Director, and joining her, Daleen Kells, Board Chair. Accompanying them is Caitlin Putland, a Community Program Manager with Integrated Justice Services, and Rod McKendrick with the Ministry of Justice. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to speaking more about Hope Restored later today and to meeting with them after question period, along with Minister Tell and Minister Ross. I ask all,
Minister of Justice.
Right. Minister of Status of Women and the Minister of Corrections and Policing. I apologize, Mr. Speaker. And I ask all members to please join me in welcoming them to their assembly.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
I'm honoured to join with the Minister in welcoming these women from Hope Restored to their Legislative Assembly. I've had the opportunity to get to know Jolene over the past few years and learn about the work that her organization does, which is incredibly important to Saskatchewan, helping women fleeing situations of trafficking, Mr. Speaker. Very excited to hear about the funding announcement from this government, and I ask all members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Environment.
I request leave to make an extended introduction.
Leave has been requested for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Carried.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, Mr. Speaker, and to all members of this Assembly, I would like to introduce and welcome several staff members of the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation who have joined us in your gallery here today. Mr. Speaker, the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation, along with their thousands of members, contributes significantly to the conservation and management of our province's fish and wildlife resources. Mr. Speaker, with that, I'm pleased to welcome today, and if you could please give a little wave when I say your name, Daryl Crabb, Executive Director. And Daryl is also a constituent of mine, Mr. Speaker, and he is the proud father of two boys, Devin and Brett, who I had the pleasure of teaching in a past life. So, Daryl and Doug Gibson, Director of Education, Courtney Devins, Director of Communication and Marketing, and Blaine Olfert, Program Technician. My colleague will elaborate a little bit later on here this afternoon on the contributions here that they have provided to the province. Thank you to each of you for everything that you do in the various roles with an organization that certainly has a long-standing and valued partnership with our government, in particular to the Ministry of Environment on so many conservation and education initiatives. And I ask all members to please join me with welcoming them to their legislature.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to enter in and join the minister opposite to welcome the leadership and staff from the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation to their assembly here today on Camo Day, on the fishing and Hunting and Trapping Heritage Day here in Saskatchewan, and to thank them for all their leadership and work on this front. The Wildlife Federation is invaluable in extending opportunity, in conservation and protection of habitat, in supporting such healthy recreation that connects so many in this province with the land and with our natural environment. Of course, hunting and fishing and trapping also bring a lot of economic activity into rural and northern communities, which is so very important. I can say, Mr. Speaker, I'd rather be in the field or on a lake any day, Mr. Speaker, than being in here, Mr. Speaker, but it's a pleasure to have these members here in their assembly here today. I'm a proud member of the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation and certainly love the outdoors and look for every, often short, but every opportunity to get out into the field. This past year, my son and I have had wonderful times hunting pheasant in South Saskatchewan. We took a beautiful mule deer buck down by Mankota just a couple weeks ago. We've had, remote paddling and portaging and fishing up on the Churchill River. The fact of the matter is this province has such incredible natural assets, and it's folks like the Wildlife Federation that allow Saskatchewan people to connect to those pursuits and to connect to the land. Here today, I simply want to ask all members to thank them for all their leadership and all their work.
Recognize the member from Melfort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, it's my privilege to introduce 21 homeschooled students and the 7 mothers who are here with their kids today. It was my privilege to go through the building and be able to answer questions. Luckily, we had the Minister of Trade and Export with us who was able to answer those questions. We were downstairs in the basement and looking in the glass cabinet, so I thought I'd step out and show my understanding of Saskatchewan's history, and I asked the kids, so what's our provincial flower? And when they looked at me and hesitated, I thought I'd give them a clue, so I said it's an animal and a flower, and then they didn't answer. So I said tiger lily, and they said, oh, actually it's the West Red Lily. So I have some questions for my grade 2 teacher myself. So some awfully bright kids up on your balcony, Mr. Speaker, and welcome here. Please join me and welcome them to here on behalf of their legislature.
Recognize a member from Melville South Coast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I would like to introduce, seated in the West Gallery, 26 grade 10 students from the Melville Comprehensive School, led by their teachers Don Coleman and Andy Rondo. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to host Melville Comprehensive, as they are very engaged in the political process and have quite often visited here in the Assembly. They're a very, very successful institution, as they've had a number of provincial and national awards when it comes to the trades. They have a very, very active SAD group and have contributed a number of players to our very successful U of S Husky football program, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like all members to welcome Melville Comprehensive School grade 10 class to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize a member from Cypress Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to welcome a young lady from the Melville group. Originally, she grew up in the Birstall, Liebenthal, Fox Valley area, and her family operated a family ranch down in the area. Yellowstone, I heard that in the background, yeah. God's country in my case, but I know that, we miss you a lot, and you'll be a great asset to the Melville group. And Warren, you have a great MLA there in that part of the world. MLA. Just MLA, okay, sorry. I'm sorry. But anyway, I'd like to welcome you all to your legislature, and welcome, Ray-Lan.
Presenting petitions. Recognize a member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan to immediately create a bipartisan committee on the mental health and addictions crisis. It's been more than 2 years since the passing of the Suicide Prevention Act, and it's past time for this government to put their words into action. It's completely unacceptable that this government sits on their hands while suicide rates for Indigenous people in Saskatchewan are 4 times higher than non-Indigenous people. And according to a new report by the FSIN, rates of hospitalization for self-harm are also significantly higher for First Nations people than everyone else, 7 times higher for females and 4 times higher for males, Mr. Speaker. This is an issue that is compounded in Saskatchewan's north. It affects our northern people much further as well. It is past time to act, Mr. Speaker. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to immediately create a bipartisan legislative committee on the mental health and addictions crisis in Saskatchewan. These petitions today are signed by individuals from Swift Current, Cabrey, Pachinak, and LaRange, Mr. Speaker. I do so present.
Hear, hear. Recognize a member from Yorkton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to present a petition on behalf of the people of Saskatchewan. It reads, we, the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan, wish to bring to the attention the following. That the Liberal NDP federal government continues to infringe on the constitutional rights of the province of Saskatchewan and implement policies that are detrimental to our province's economic well-being. That the commitments and actions of the federal government have made the control of Saskatchewan's resource sector and rights unclear. That an unsupportive federal government will continue to impede Saskatchewan's potential to play a global role in providing resources to the world market. Mr. Speaker, the prayer reads, we in the prayer reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action. To call upon the Government of Saskatchewan to implement Saskatchewan's first policies and legislation that will support the development of Saskatchewan as a global supplier of food, fuel and fertilizer without federal infringement on Saskatchewan's constitutional authority. Mr. Speaker, signers of this petition are from Regina and Lipton. I so submit.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy to be on my feet to bring forth concerns from people of Saskatchewan in a petition to the government to fix the rural healthcare staffing crisis. Those who signed the petition would like us to know that recruitment and retention of healthcare professionals is particularly challenging in rural areas where they've seen many disruptions in emergency room care, acute care, lab and x-ray service disruptions, and that the ongoing pandemic has created burnout and led to challenges for healthcare workers at all stages of their career, which is having a massive ripple effect throughout communities around our province. Again, I'll note that at the 2021 SARM Convention, 94% of rural leaders voted to support a resolution acknowledging the nursing and healthcare worker shortage across Saskatchewan, and we know that rural healthcare will be a top concern at the SARM Convention in Saskatoon beginning tomorrow. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to fix the rural healthcare staffing crisis. This petition today is signed by residents of Wilkie, and I do so present.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Meewasin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present our petition to prohibit conversion therapy. This petition is more important than ever as we continue to see allegations of abuse and discrimination against queer people come to light in Saskatchewan. Ontario, Nova Scotia, PEI, Yukon and Quebec have enacted their own legislation addressing different aspects of conversion therapy in their jurisdictions. We need legislation to ban conversion therapy in Saskatchewan to protect vulnerable children and adults from this heinous practice. Thus, the undersigned residents would like to bring to our attention the following. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Code names sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity as one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination. Conversion therapy uses discredited and abusive practices which attempt to actively change the sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to ban the practice of conversion therapy and prohibit transporting of youth and young adults outside of Saskatchewan for such purposes. Mr. Speaker, the signatories today reside in Regina. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions, statements by members. I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Mewasin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Each year at this time, we recognize Transgender Awareness Week to help raise the visibility of transgender people and the issue of transphobic violence across the globe. In honor of this week, I want to recognize 2 organizations and a number of individuals who are contributing to our province. One such organization is TransSask Support Services, which engages in advocacy, research programs, and outreach to improve lives and build community. TransSask is excited to soon release a community research report, Mr. Speaker, with data from surveys and sharing circles of over 300 Two-Spirit, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people in the province. Thank you to the staff, Claire, Tiberius, Elijah, and Ken, as well as the Board of Directors, Bobby Sue, Janae, Jake, Lex, Mel, Bren, Shannon, Tanis, and Josephine. Another project of note is the Trans Health Navigator pilot project led by Drs. Megan Clark and Stephanie Medill. Alongside navigators Elijah and Ken and partners in Out Saskatoon and UR Pride, their research aims to provide affirming care services for trans and gender diverse people navigating the healthcare system in Saskatchewan. I'd like all members to please join me in recognizing Transgender Awareness Week and all the folks doing amazing work to make Saskatchewan a better place to live.
Recognize a member from Prince Albert Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House to recognize today as Hunting, Fishing and Trapping Heritage Day. In the fall of 2009, our government passed the Hunting, Fishing, Trapping Heritage Act, designating November 15th each year to celebrate the special role that these activities have played in the lives of generations of Saskatchewan people. For countless generations, Saskatchewan people have hunted, fished, and trapped for food, for commercial purposes, and for the spiritual renewal that comes from spending time in the outdoors. And before many of us came here, the First Nations of the Plains hunted, trapped, and fished on these lands for thousands of years. And their traditional knowledge was essential to the survival of many early settlers and pioneers when they arrived. Every November 15th, we take time to remind ourselves of the important role that these traditions continue to play. Today is also referred to less formally as Camo Day, with everyone invited to wear camouflage clothing to show their support for our province's heritage. The Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation has made this a little easier for members of this assembly who may not keep a camo blazer in their closet by providing the pocket squares and kerchiefs that you see us supporting today. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to recognize hunting, fishing, and trapping as important parts of our province's heritage and history. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, I was proud to attend the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Clarence Campo Development Fund, along with many members from both sides. The CCDF was established by agreement between the Métis Society of Saskatchewan and the provincial government of former Premier Roy Romanow. The objective of the fund, Mr. Speaker, is to stimulate economic development activities of Métis people and communities by providing equity for businesses, support to community economic development initiatives, and assistance for the development of the management of skills of new and existing Métis entrepreneurs. Named after the great Métis negotiator and champion of resistance and social justice, Clarence Campo, this fund has created 13,462 jobs, stewarded over $86 million in repayable and non-repayable contributions, and leveraged nearly $200 million. The building of strong communities, wealth, job creation, and innovation are the bedrock of entrepreneurship. The remarkable leaders who have succeeded and excelled through their relationships with the CCDF are numerous, and locally, I can think of a few. Amplify Media, Bravo Tango, Mako Collision Repair, Farmer John's Local Market, Ray Goslin Architects, Extended Hydraulics, Farrell Peril, and Outlaw Communications, just to name a few. A true partner and catalyst for Saskatchewan's development, I ask all members to join me in congratulating the CCDF on 25 exceptional years.
Recognize a member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about another tremendous Saskatchewan-made business located in Emerald Park. Extended Hydraulics was established in 2013 and is 100% Indigenous owned and operated. Mr. Speaker, I had the pleasure of touring their facilities in early November and seeing their manufacturing process for items such as cylinders. These and all other parts they manufacture and refurbished are used in the oil and gas, utilities, and mining industries. Mr. Speaker, another innovative product they manufacture is the X-Quill, an automatic retractable chemical injection quill used on pipelines to keep oil moving and chemicals away from the pipe walls to reduce corrosion. Extended Hydraulics have partnered with the Saskatchewan Research Council on the use and development of radio frequency identification tags with their products to track development and monitor productivity in real time, and they are seeing great results. Mr. Speaker, I commend Extended Hydraulics for uplifting our resource sectors by supporting our Indigenous workforce and even offering to pay for their Red Seal qualifications. I now ask all members to join me in applauding the great work that Extended Hydraulics is doing in Saskatchewan. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Regina Walsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1909, the 4th Earl of Grey, who was serving as the Governor-General at the time, had a trophy commissioned and made it available to the Canadian Dominion of Football Championship. Over a century later, the Grey Cup has become more than just a trophy that's awarded every year to the champions of the CFL, Mr. Speaker. It is a symbol of Canadiana. This week, the Grey Cup is back where it belongs. The CFL Championship is back in the heartland. And while it'll be teams from Winnipeg and Toronto competing on the field, it will be the fans from all across the country that will make this week so special. It's a celebration of Canada right here in the Queen City. Now, this marks the 4th time our province has hosted the Grey Cup, starting back when we welcomed the country to huddle up in Saskatchewan. Each time, the people of Regina and the 306 have welcomed fans from the Atlantic Schooners to the Lions Den in BC, right here to where football matters most. What makes the Grey Cup so special and great is that it's like a big, countrywide family reunion. Each year, friends from opposite ends of the country meet, they share stories, they look at pictures, they reminisce about the last year. Grey Cup is much more than 3 downs and touchdowns, Mr. Speaker, and trust me when I say nobody does Grey Cup better than Saskatchewan. I've had the privilege to go all across the country to Grey Cups, and we do it better here, and we're going to do it great this week. So to the teams, the fans, and the country, welcome to Riderville, welcome to the Grey Cup, and welcome to the Heartland.
Recognize the member from Regina Coronation Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past August, I, along with a member from Regina University, participated in a fundraising event, Walk the Walk, the celebrity drag show for Lulu's Lodge in Regina. Lulu's Lodge is a transitional home run by the John Howard Society to provide safe space for vulnerable youth, for vulnerable homeless LGBTQ 2S+ youth. It was launched in 2018 and is a home for individuals between the ages of 16 and 21 who are facing homelessness. It is not uncommon for many of the youth who come to Lulu's Lodge to have to leave their own homes. I was honoured to join along with other dignitaries, including the mayors of Saskatoon and Regina, where over $238,000 was raised in support of Lulu's Lodge shelter program and successfully paid off their mortgage. Somehow, I was judged to be the eventual winner of the show competition. I want to thank my mentor, Gerard Dillman, a.k.a. Yada, for their help and guidance, and I'd also like to thank Nule Monigbo from our caucus office for helping me with my costume changes. Lulu's Lodge is not only a safe space for vulnerable youth, but also provides vital services to support disenfranchised youth, including mentorship and mental health support. Please join me in congratulating the organizers of the successful fundraiser. Thank Lulu's Lodge, the John Howard Society for the crucial and valuable support for LGBTQ 2S+ youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Moose Jaw North.
Mr. Speaker, this morning we received even more great news about our economy. Saskatchewan is leading the nation in wholesale trade growth, which increased by 49.5% year over year. Mr. Speaker, not only are we seeing growth in wholesale trade, but manufacturing sales also increased 24.1% year over year. Saskatchewan is also leading the nation when it comes to investment in building construction growth, which increased by 56.2% year over year, Mr. Speaker. These indicators are further proof that Saskatchewan has exactly what the world needs. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to promote Saskatchewan on the world stage. The members opposite continue to talk down our international engagement strategy, Mr. Speaker, but we will continue to attract people and investments to this province. Under the NDP, we saw investments flee our province and population decrease. The only increases when they were in charge were in suitcase sales, Mr. Speaker. We are proud that under this government, we are seeing record population growth. We are proud that limitless potential in the form of jobs, economic growth, and opportunities exist here. In fact, just this year, over 50 delegations from around the world visited our province, Mr. Speaker, to explore the many opportunities that Saskatchewan has to offer. Mr. Speaker, with this, what we see under this government truly is growth that works for everyone.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
The average Saskatchewan family will pay almost $1,000 more for groceries this year. Yesterday, when we asked the Premier about record food bank use, the Premier told us how great these inflationary pressures are for his government's bottom line. Wow. Mr. Speaker, 40% of these users are children and many are seniors. And that Premier is bragging about how great things are. Mr. Speaker, what's that Premier's plan to use that healthy bottom line to help thousands of Saskatchewan people who are now relying on food banks just to get by?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Premier.
I think first and foremost, Mr. Speaker, starting yesterday, the tax affordability, or pardon me, the Saskatchewan affordability tax credit checks are arriving in homes, Mr. Speaker, in mailboxes across this province. That was a $450 million decision that this government made to help families, and all of those 18 over and over, Mr. Speaker, to address some of the affordability challenges that, yes, we're experiencing here in Saskatchewan and we're experiencing across Canada. But I would go further to say that each and every year, affordability measures are in each and every budget that this provides, Mr. Speaker, that this government decides on, Mr. Speaker, about $2 billion total. I've said that many times in here, Mr. Speaker. That's how we've been able to remove 112,000 people off the tax rolls, Mr. Speaker. A family of four in this province starts to pay provincial income tax at about $53,000 when they achieve $53,000 of household income. Mr. Speaker, under the members opposite, when they had the opportunity to govern, that point where Saskatchewan family of four started to pay provincial income tax was not $53,000, it was $26,000, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that government presided over the biggest PST, the biggest tax hike in the history of this province, and we saw 32 fee and tax hikes in this past budget alone. And now Saskatchewan will see the biggest spike in food prices in the country this year. You'd think that the Premier would at least be curious about why. Today, we're calling on that government to launch an investigation into food prices in this province, to study grocery and supply chain issues, fair pricing for Saskatchewan's livestock producers, and food security issues in Saskatchewan's north. Will the Premier join us as we move to strike a special committee of the legislature, Mr. Speaker, to tackle food prices in Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the Minister of Agriculture, I have met with the livestock sector and the grain sector in this province ever since I've become minister, on an open-door policy whenever they want to meet. I've met with Saskatchewan stockgrowers frequently. In fact, I've met with them since their press release on this issue on the food pricing. The stock growers themselves have said the best issue is for them to take it to the Canadian Competition Bureau, and that's where it should be taken, and that organization will do that. We have got a lot of programs in place that work for the benefit of the agriculture sector here in the province of Saskatchewan. If you look just what we did in the previous year with the drought for the livestock sector, when we doubled the low-yield appraisal threshold for crop insurance customers so they could take that cereal crop and write it off, and have their neighbour who had cattle with shortage of feed was able to come and cut that crop for feed and feed their cattle for the year. The Farm and Ranch Water Infrastructure Program, we doubled that. Mr. Speaker, I've got a lot more answers to this question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier sits down on this one, and more self-congratulations from the members opposite. Yet people in this province are struggling to put food on the table, and our producers aren't getting a fair price for their cattle. And in Saskatchewan's north, where the cost of living is already off the charts, people are paying $16 for a jug of milk, $18 for a bag of apples. The Premier needs to wake up and take this seriously, and Saskatchewan people need answers. Again, to the Premier, will he commit to a food pricing investigation today?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, we've introduced a lot of programs to protect the livestock sector here and the agriculture sector here in the province of Saskatchewan. Just to name a few on the livestock price insurance, where we've made dramatic improvements to the forage rainfall insurance, Mr. Speaker, the forage yield insurance, Mr. Speaker. We introduced the livestock price insurance, Mr. Speaker. We also have a cordon heat unit, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell you one thing that's driving up the cost of food. There's a few things that are driving up the cost of food and will continue to drive up the cost of food. Obviously, the carbon tax. The carbon tax has the biggest impact to the agriculture industry in the province of Saskatchewan. We pay it for every product coming into our farm, and we pay for it every bushel leaving our farm as well, Mr. Speaker. That's the issue. Now they got a federal government that's wanting to target productivity here in the province by targeting a fertilizer emission reduction, Mr. Speaker. We're the members opposite speaking on that. We'd like to hear their voice on that and be supporting of us, not supporting those issues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, that word salad might be free, but lettuce is up over 20% at grocery stores across Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, the committee that we've proposed would work directly with the Federal Agriculture Committee as well as with the Competition Bureau. It's about fairness for consumers and for livestock producers. We see the prices at grocery stores that are through the roof. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the meat aisle or at the meat counter, Mr. Speaker. Since March, the price for ground beef is up 10%. Chicken breasts, 11%. Chicken thighs and drumsticks, 14% and 29%. And steaks are up a whopping 31%. Why won't this Premier commit to an investigation into and tackling these prices today?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, this government has always stood behind the agriculture sector in this province, and we will continue to stand behind the agriculture sector in this province. We have, all you have to do is look at our programs. Look at our crop insurance program. Highest acreage coverage in history. Highest payout in history last year, well over $2 billion for the crop insurance industry and the livestock sector as well, Mr. Speaker. I've got a lot of constituents in my area that have gone through the drought and gone through those issues and have actually called me and said, thank you very much for the programs you've had that are carrying us through, Mr. Speaker. Those are real stories. Those are real families, Mr. Speaker, that are thanking us and for the programs that we have in place on their behalf. Mr. Speaker, the biggest challenge they have right now is the carbon tax and the tax they have to pay, as I said, product going into the province, product going out of their farm and onto their farm, and everything they do, Mr. Speaker. It's very important for us, and even on the federal government's target for emission fertilizer reduction, it's going to have a huge impact on the price of food, Mr. Speaker, if they continue down that path. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Regina Rosemont.
I was chatting with many livestock producers throughout that minister's very riding, Mr. Speaker, this last couple of weeks, and that's not what they're saying about this government right now, Mr. Speaker. Families are paying more and more at the meat counter, but those dollars aren't making their way in a fair way to livestock producers in this province. Stock growers aren't seeing corresponding increases, and even though families are paying record prices at the grocery stores. A government that cared about families and a government that cared about producers would want to get to the bottom of it. It's a matter of fairness. Why won't the Sask Party government support an investigation into and tackling meat pricing that leaves families paying more and producers taking home less and facing hardship?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you what we've done for the livestock sector in this province, Mr. Speaker. In the Farm and Ranch Water Program last year through the drought, for the livestock sector only, we raised the cap for well drilling and for water pipelines to $150,000 per individual, of which on that extra $100,000, the province kicked in 70% of those dollars. There's where we help the livestock sector. $119 million in direct payment through agri-recovery, over $200 per head for breeding stock on the farms and ranches here in this province. We have been there to support the livestock sector and the grains and oilseed sector in this province, and we will continue to do so. The problem and the issue is the carbon tax that's on every farmer that they pay on product coming into their farm and product leaving their farm. For everything that is made, Mr. Speaker, and those members opposite support the carbon tax.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Well, I guess don't let the facts get in the way, hey, Mr. Speaker. We've been clear about our concerns federally as well, Mr. Speaker, but this goes back to this government, and the committee we're calling for relates directly to grocery pricing as well as meat pricing, Mr. Speaker. This government should be concerned about what's going on with meat prices. Families are paying through the nose, and producers aren't seeing the benefits that they should be. In fact, they're facing serious hardship. Producer groups like the Saskatchewan Stock Growers have called for an investigation back in July. Of course, we joined them in that call, Mr. Speaker, and we're fighting for that here today as well. But this government's done nothing. Why doesn't this government want to get to the bottom of where the money is going when it comes to meat pricing and grocery pricing to ensure fairness for producers, for stock growers, and consumers in Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Hear, hear. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know how many times I have to repeat it for the members opposite. If they really wanted to do something for the agriculture industry in this province, they'd have done it when they were in government, and they did nothing for the agriculture sector in this province for 17 years, Mr. Speaker. Me as a farmer myself had to go through those times, Mr. Speaker. We have done a lot for the agriculture industry here in the province of Saskatchewan. They could come on board and say they don't support a carbon tax. I haven't heard those words come out of their mouths yet, Mr. Speaker, where they say no to the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. Where are they on the fertilizer emission reduction, Mr. Speaker? Haven't said a word on the fertilizer emission reduction targets, Mr. Speaker. Not one word, Mr. Speaker. And we've said what our concerns about that. If you want to see food prices increase, continue down the path of Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberals on their fertilizer emission, and watch what happened to food prices in this country, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months now, the allegations of violence and abuse at some qualified independent schools under this government's watch has dominated the news, and it's also damaged Saskatchewan's reputation. Now, so far, this has been an issue of human rights and also an issue of quality of education, but now it's been elevated to an issue of public safety after Caitlin Erickson's family home was targeted by vandalism, including graffiti of a Bible verse, and a fire that later killed her family pets. She should not have to live in fear for speaking out. Will the Premier condemn these attacks on Caitlin's family home and finally meet with her?
Recognize Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, certainly, as the members know, I've met twice with Ms. Erickson. Mr. Speaker, we absolutely, as a government, condemn what has taken place with respect to Ms. Erickson, her family, her home. Mr. Speaker, nobody in this province should have to go through any ordeal like that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is why this government has invested significant dollars in terms of public safety, Mr. Speaker, including this very year, Mr. Speaker, and as a part of this throne speech. So let me be very clear. We absolutely condemn what has taken place.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the condemnation, but the question was to Caitlin's MLA, and that is the Premier. Mr. Speaker, Caitlin isn't the only one that's broken silence by taking a stand on the violence and substandard education at qualified independent schools. Countless former students have joined both the lawsuit and the movement. Just yesterday, another story from Global Saskatoon highlighted another former qualified independent school student traumatized by what he calls a cult and a school that he says needs to be shut down. Can the Sask Party government do something, anything really, to set an example to ensure that those speaking out about their abuse can do so without worrying about their safety?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it goes without saying, but I will say it, Mr. Speaker, for anybody that is speaking out about their experiences at any school in this province, Mr. Speaker, they should be able to do so freely, Mr. Speaker, without fear of their safety or reprisal from anyone, Mr. Speaker. And so, again, I would say, with respect to what happened to Ms. Erickson, Mr. Speaker, we absolutely condemn that.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, this government has done so little to offer reform, justice, or amends of any kind since the issues of abuse at qualified independent schools were brought to light and brought to that minister's office. In turn, people like Caitlin, Coy, Stephanie, Cody, and others have had to go public and speak out in an attempt to expose the injustice at qualified independent schools. Their courage has not been without blowback. But now a family and their property has been put in danger. Does the minister realize that his government's failure to act when these concerns were first brought to his office left these victims with no choice but to go public?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would disagree with the premise of the question, Mr. Speaker. When the allegations, in terms of who the allegations were against, the Ministry of Education took immediate action, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the people named in those allegations, that information was sent to the Saskatchewan Professional Teachers Regulatory Body. Within a day, Mr. Speaker, by the next day, Cabinet approved amendments to the regulations to strengthen what had already been taking place since 2012, Mr. Speaker. I think people know that many of these allegations predate that time, Mr. Speaker, in fact, predate this government, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the amendments that were made to the regulations in 2012, that certainly did provide additional oversight that didn't exist, certainly didn't exist at the time of many of these allegations, Mr. Speaker. We've taken additional action, Mr. Speaker, and we're looking to see what additional action we may take in the future.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, I will ask again to the Premier. His constituent has brought these concerns to him. Her family has now been targeted with violence and threats. Will he meet with his constituent to hear her concerns face to face?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I've met with Ms. Erickson twice, Mr. Speaker, and we absolutely, as a government, condemn what has taken place.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, leave it to the Sask Party government to quickly dismiss this $167 million Ames debacle, which had to be paused just 1 week after it went live. But no big deal. We're talking about $167 million. For that sum, you could build a new hospital, hire more healthcare workers, or provide affordability relief for parents just trying to get by. To the minister, how many more millions of taxpayer money is it going to take to fix this Sask Party gong show?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as was identified last week, there were some issues specifically with the payroll and the scheduling, Mr. Speaker. Upon realizing this, we immediately paused what we were doing, Mr. Speaker, went back to our legacy systems. Mr. Speaker, this is a very complex issue. We're talking about 48,000 employees, over 80 systems from the health regions that were previous before the amalgamation, Mr. Speaker. And again, some of these systems are 50 years old. Mr. Speaker, we are going to get to a point where we can get AIMS up and running, Mr. Speaker, but we want to make sure that that I have the confidence and the team, the SHA, have the confidence to be able to make sure that that system is operating as it should be, Mr. Speaker. Until that point, we will rely on the systems that we have been using for the last few years. And Mr. Speaker, when we're ready, we'll make sure that we launch AIMS. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, the minister wants a gold star for trying, but the bar is so much higher than that. Frankly, I'd expect more contrition from a government that has blown taxpayer money on one failed IT contract after another, like a kid in a candy store. Lincoln was originally slated for $15 million, and it ended up costing taxpayers $75 million, 5 times over budget. Now we have this AIMS debacle to the tune of $167 million, which went down like a lead balloon just 1 week into operation. Did the Sask Party government negotiate cost recovery into their AIMS contract, or how much money are we losing on this?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, even though we did have to pause AIMS, the team at the SHA and eHealth worked very diligently to make sure that they made payroll on time. And Mr. Speaker, they had to do that early because of the stat of Remembrance Day on the Friday, Mr. Speaker. They were able to get that payroll complete, and I thank them for doing that hard work. Mr. Speaker, we do have to upgrade our system. If the opposition thinks that we should keep operating a 50-year-old system in perpetuity, then I'd like them to stand up and say that, Mr. Speaker. We have to upgrade our systems. This is part of the amalgamation of all of the old health regions. Some of them, again, 50 years old, 48,000 employees, Mr. Speaker. We have 6 labor agreements. This is a very complex process, Mr. Speaker. We did pause it. We're confident that our legacy systems will keep going, Mr. Speaker, and the SHA, when they're ready to, they will inform me, and we can get AIMS going. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Fairview.
6 years into the SHA amalgamation experiment, and if the AIMS launch is any indication, it is failing, Mr. Speaker. We were promised that amalgamation would save money. We were promised this would help with our broken ambulance system. We were promised a single IT system that would save $9 million a year. None of this happened. In fact, it is the opposite, Mr. Speaker. Ambulance response times in rural areas are unacceptable, and you're lucky if you get one in the cities. Administrative costs have continued to grow, and now we're on the hook for nearly $170 million, while the entire program is shut down. Why is this government so reckless with Saskatchewan people's money? Can't they get anything right? Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, there has been no money lost on this. This is an investment in our IT system of AIMS, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to do that to make sure that the system is not just for today, but for the future, Mr. Speaker. And as far as the amalgamation of the health region, I'll remind the members opposite, during that 6 years, we kind of had a 2-year pandemic in there, Mr. Speaker, that kind of slowed things down. So, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with that to be able to make sure that our IT system is in proper shape, to be able to make the payroll, the scheduling, also the procurement, Mr. Speaker, because this is critically important to making sure, again, Mr. Speaker, that we have patient safety and that our valuable healthcare staff get paid on time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was cold last night, and it will be colder still tonight. MLAs will be warm and safe in our homes, but not everyone is so lucky. Homeless people in Regina are bracing for a bitter winter, and elsewhere across the province, 2 people have already died, Mr. Speaker. Owasso, Regina's only warm-up shelter, was able to offer relief to some 900 people daily, but they closed in June due to lack of funding from this province. Will the government commit to funding warm-up shelters across the province to spare us more preventable freezing deaths this winter?
Recognize Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, yes, this is a very serious issue. We've been through this before. It's a very complex issue as well, not only here in Saskatchewan, but right across the country and across North America. We thank our CBOs that we work with. Mr. Speaker, we've recently come up with $1.7 million on top of 388 spaces we've had for shelter in this province regularly, 60 new spaces, again with that 1.7 million just recently announced. Mr. Speaker, we're working very hard with our CBO sector, as I mentioned, several announcements over this past year for increased cap on the capital side, the location, the member references here in Regina, that was donated to that organization in order to have programming, Mr. Speaker. And so the other, I can go through all the other things we're doing on the housing side as well, Mr. Speaker, in terms of partnering with STC, for example. Regina Treaty Service here in Regina, Mr. Speaker, will continue along with that.
Recognize a member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the minister said we've been through this before. Yes, we have. And people have died, and there have been 10 cities, and we don't want to see that happen again, Mr. Speaker. So with that, on Sunday, a Regina house owned by Sask Housing exploded. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured because no one was living there. No one was living there because, according to Sask Housing, there is little demand for units in the North Central neighbourhood. Homelessness is a crisis in this city, and yet the government claims people would rather live in a tent than at 6th and Retallick. Something doesn't add up, Mr. Speaker. How many Sask housing units are left empty, and how does the minister plan to get people off the streets and into housing?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, certainly again a complex issue that all municipalities and our partners in the CBO sector are working on in terms of the situation we've recently talked about here. That is a serious issue, Mr. Speaker. It is currently with the police, so I won't make too many comments on that. But I know there are, I've asked officials to consider whether we want to have a different approach with vacant housing, Mr. Speaker, ensuring they're secure, but also whether we leave the gas and power on, and how we do inspections to make sure that those places are secure into the future, Mr. Speaker. We're also helping those that may have been displaced by this incident. Mr. Speaker, it's a complex issue I've mentioned before. We're going to continue to work with our partners in the sector.
Hear, hear.
Ministerial statements. I recognize Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2021-22, the government announced $6.4 million annually for the Saskatchewan Trafficking Response Team. Given this increased investment, it's anticipated that there will be an increased number of victims identified who will require services as they attempt to exit the cycle of human trafficking, Mr. Speaker, which is why I'm very pleased to announce that our government is providing $150,000 directly to Hope Restored Canada to support the organization and help those trying to escape sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And work, Mr. Speaker, with Hope Restored has been underway for several months. Hope Restored opened the first long-term safe housing property in Saskatoon for those escaping human trafficking, abuse, and domestic violence in 2019. Since its opening, the Safe House has been able to accommodate 38 long-term participants in the program. Mr. Speaker, Hope Restored is an organization that focuses on helping those who are exploited and trafficked through education, partnerships, funding, and programs. Mr. Speaker, they use trauma-informed approaches, resiliency education that promotes and nurtures healthy relationships, with the goal of supporting participants in engaging in the community and their reintegration as thriving members of society. Mr. Speaker, human trafficking is too prevalent in Canada and across the province and needs to be addressed to protect victims and our communities. Girls as young as 13 are being recruited into human trafficking, and the COVID-19 pandemic significantly reduced escape options. Hope Restored is unique in that it's the only agency that that provides extensive services to stabilize, heal, train and transition those impacted by human trafficking. The work of Hope Restored must continue, and our government looks forward to working alongside it in the effort to combat human trafficking. We are proud, Mr. Speaker, that we can provide the funding needed for Hope Restored to continue its very important work. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for providing a copy of the remarks in advance. As the Minister had mentioned, Hope Restored Canada does incredibly important work in Saskatchewan and is very unique in the work that they do, as being the only service in the province that specifically helps women who are who have been targeted and have been trafficked in the province. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister mentioned, this is a problem that is tragically far too prevalent in Saskatchewan and in Western Canada. Mr. Speaker, the work that this organization and their team do is incredibly important. Mr. Speaker, so important in Saskatchewan that we do truly hope that this funding announcement will become permanent and will become ongoing as part of the regular budget cycle, so Hope Restored Canada can do the important work that they need to do and not have to worry about funding year to year. I'd like to thank them once again for the incredibly important work that they do every single day, helping those who we often forget, who desperately need help and the support, and very much look forward to their continued work in the community and their continued help in serving those who are so much in need. Thank you.
Introduction of bills. No. Ministerial statement. I recognize Minister of CIC.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to highlight our government's commitment to ensuring that Saskatchewan people have access to the highest quality internet services. Broadband has become a critical component of modern society, and as Saskatchewan's homegrown communications leader, SaskTel is firmly committed to be the best at connecting the people of this province to the world. SaskTel's fibre optic broadband network, Infinite, delivers download speeds close to 1 gigabyte per second and upload speeds of 500 megabits per second. This capability allows subscribers to surf, stream, game, chat, and share however much content they want at incredible speeds. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to announce that more people than ever before will have access to SaskTel's blazing fast internet. Today, our government announced that we have directed SaskTel to double their investment in the Rural Fibre Initiative. This directive will see SaskTel invest an additional $100 million in expanding SaskTel's Infinite service to more than 80 towns and villages by the end of March 2025. Mr. Speaker, this investment will help narrow the digital divide in Saskatchewan by connecting tens of thousands of rural households and businesses to SaskTel's fibre optic network. Once complete, SaskTel will have invested $200 million in the Rural Fibre Initiative and have brought Infinite service to over 110,000 additional residences and businesses across 131 rural communities. At that time, SaskTel's Infinite network, already Saskatchewan's largest fibre optic broadband network, will be available in more than 150 communities and reach approximately 80% of the homes in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, that's growth that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, some of the communities that will benefit from today's announcement, and I apologize if I sound like I'm a dispatcher at a bus company, but it includes Aberdeen, Balcarres, Beauval, Big River, Carnduff, Churchbridge, Cudworth, Delisle, Grand Coulee, Grenfell, Hague, Hepburn, Herbert, Ituna, Kelvington, Kerrobert, Langenburg, Lashburn, Leader, Maidstone, Milestone, Pence, Pinehouse, Porcupine Plain, Radville, Southey, Spiritwood, Stoughton, Strasbourg, Waldheim, Watson, Wilkie, and Wolseley. Mr. Speaker, these communities are all included in Phase 5 of the Rural Fibre Initiative, and communities are still being finalized for Phase 6, with an announcement to come early next year. The rural fibre announcement, along with SaskTel's significant investment in its 5G rollout, will ensure that Saskatchewan remains one of the most well-connected provinces in Canada. Mr. Speaker, our government has chosen to invest in Saskatchewan first. Saskatchewan people are seeing a $200 million investment in fibre internet. Under the NDP, Saskatchewan people saw $16 million lost on NST Chicago, a U.S. Midwest fibre optics company, $9.4 million on Persona Inc., a Newfoundland cable company, $24.7 million lost on Retex, an Atlanta-based .com startup, $3 million lost on Clickabid.com, a failed internet auction business meant to compete with eBay, $5.6 million lost on SoftTrax Enterprises Limited, a wireless electronic payment company, $90.8 million lost on Navigata Communications, a BC telecom company, $40 million lost in Austere Communications, an Australian-based communication company, and $10 million lost on Craig Wireless, a Manitoba internet company. Mr. Speaker, that is $200 million lost by the previous NDP government on out-of-province internet and telecommunication companies. Unlike the NDP, our focus remains on investing in Saskatchewan people and businesses. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to close. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite are chirping from their seat because they don't like what we're saying. Mr. Speaker, I'll close by quoting SUMA President Randy Golden. Open quote, "We are pleased to see SaskTel continue to address this gap with additional funding. Connectivity is a priority for all of our communities and a key to the viability of our small members in the future." End quote. Mr. Speaker, we agree. Our government will continue using the strength of our crowns to improve the quality of life for people right across this province and to create growth that works for everyone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognized member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, what an unfortunate and tacky set of remarks by that minister, Mr. Speaker, who should know better than to be reading remarks that seem to be crafted by the government House Leader over there, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to connectivity, it's clear that, that it's no longer a luxury, that it's an essential service for Saskatchewan people. This official opposition, the Saskatchewan NDP, will continue to push to make connectivity happen all across Saskatchewan, in rural and First Nations communities and in northern communities. We've been pressing this government hard on this front, as have organizations like SARM, Mr. Speaker, and APAS, and so many more, Mr. Speaker, that know how important rural, northern, and First Nations connectivity is across Saskatchewan. What we see here today isn't a commitment of a single new dime by this government, despite having windfall revenues, Mr. Speaker. In fact, you've got the minister telling SaskTel how to spend their dollars, Mr. Speaker. SaskTel themselves are an incredible company that represent incredible value to the people of Saskatchewan. We've been calling for a real solution, Mr. Speaker, that would provide SaskTel with the capital to connect Saskatchewan communities. Mr. Speaker, we've been calling for this government to forego the $100 million dividend that SaskTel is forced to provide to this government each and every year. It just doesn't make sense for this government to slow walk connectivity, and the result of this government thinking they can just direct the expenditure of SaskTel, which is a fraction of what we're calling for when we're saying foregoing the dividend, Mr. Speaker, simply means that that Crown Corporation is going to have to borrow more and pass those rates, higher rates, along to Saskatchewan people. We're calling for a real investment and for connectivity to be made a priority, Mr. Speaker. We're also calling for connectivity to include all Saskatchewan communities in a fair and equitable way. As I look at the list of communities, I don't see a single one of the 73 First Nations across Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. I don't see any mention, Mr. Speaker, of Minnestickwin First Nation, for an example, with over 1,000 residents, Mr. Speaker, whom we stood with leadership of Chief Crooked Neck and others calling for that inequity to be addressed, Mr. Speaker. So we don't see equity on those fronts. We don't see the kind of investment and priority that this should be, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to SaskTel, though, Mr. Speaker, what we have seen is a government that's been all too willing to undermine it, to weaken it, to outsource contract after contract, job after job, and when given the chance, actually take a run at privatizing it, Mr. Speaker, selling it off. Of course, Saskatchewan people rose up. SaskTel is an incredible company. We need to continue to support it and put it in its best position to connect Saskatchewan and fulfill its role. The minister went on with tacky remarks about previous spending, Mr. Speaker, and it's a bit of a clown show, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the actual losses from the fiscal incompetence of this government, Mr. Speaker. Think of the GTH land scandal, Mr. Speaker, that ripped off nuns, Mr. Speaker, and that filled the pockets of those with connections to this government, Mr. Speaker. Think of the bypass with the biggest overrun in Saskatchewan's history, over $1 billion, Mr. Speaker, almost $2 billion for that bypass, Mr. Speaker. Think of the Lincoln system that was once projected to be $15 million, that then shot up to $75 million, Mr. Speaker. Or think of the Ames system, Mr. Speaker, that we're speaking about here today on the floor of the Assembly, now over $160 million. I could go on and on with Sask party waste from that tax and squander government, Mr. Speaker, but that's not what we should be focused on in these remarks, but that's where the minister chose to go. The Saskatchewan NDP, the official opposition, are going to continue to stand with Saskatchewan people and communities and agricultural producers and First Nations and northern communities to make connectivity happen now. We'll make it a priority. We'll make sure SaskTel has the capital that it needs to make that happen, Mr. Speaker. We won't undermine SaskTel in that effort. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. I recognize the government Deputy House Leader.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Please state your point of order.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Rosemont stated that we ripped off people. Mr. Speaker, this is obviously unparliamentary language. The member should stand in his place and apologize.
Recognize the opposition House Leader.
The phrase ripped off has been used many times in this House and has not been found to be unparliamentary. I ask that you find, Mr. Speaker, that point of order is not well taken. Absolutely.
I will take it under advisement. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, Honourable Mr. Makowski.
I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 103, the Accessible Saskatchewan Act, be now introduced and read a first time.
It is being moved by the Minister that Bill number 103 be now introduced and read the first time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister.
Sitting.
Next sitting.
We can just pass it right away.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Before orders of the day, I wish to inform the Assembly that the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, Mr. Gregory Poots, has given notice of retirement effective January 1st, 2023. I also wish to inform the Assembly the Board of Internal Economy has considered the selection of a new clerk. Government House Leader, Deputy House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, in consideration of the retirement notice of the clerk, I request leave to move a motion concerning the appointment of a new clerk effective January 1, 2023.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. The Government House Leader may proceed.
That pursuant to Section 77.1 of the Legislative Assembly Act 2007, Ms. Iris Lang of Regina, Saskatchewan, be appointed Clerk of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan effective January 1, 2023.
Hear, hear.
It has been moved by the Government House Leader that pursuant to Section 77.1 of the Legislative Assembly Act 2007, Ms. Iris Lang of Regina, Saskatchewan, be appointed Clerk of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan effective January 1st, 2023. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Orders of the day. I recognize the member from Regina, Rosemont.
I'd like to seek a leave to move a motion under Rule 61.
Will the member briefly state the purpose of the motion and read the text of the motion? Reckon.
This simple motion would strike a special committee to get to the bottom of food pricing and meat pricing in Saskatchewan. It's about fairness for consumers and for producers. My friend, the Opposition House Leader, shared the text of the motion with the Government House Leader earlier today, and I hope all members would give me leave to move the following motion: that a special committee on food pricing be created to examine food pricing issues in Saskatchewan, including but not limited to factors related to supply chains, manufacturing, transportation, and anti-competitive corporate practices impacting the price consumers pay for food in grocery stores. 2, factors relating to meat processing and packing that increase prices for consumers and decrease prices paid to livestock producers. And 3, factors related to the disproportionately high prices for food in northern Saskatchewan. And further, that the Special Committee on Food Pricing may cooperate, correspond, and share information with the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and/or the Competition Bureau of Canada as needed.
The member from Regina Rosemont has requested leave to move without notice a motion of urgent and pressing necessity under Rule 61. Is leave granted? No. Leave has not been granted. Next order of business.
Written questions. Question number 42, asked by Ms. Wilson.
I recognize the Government Deputy Whip.
I wish to order question 42.
Question 42 is ordered.
Government orders, second reading, item number 2. Bill number 102, Constitutional Questions Amendment Act 2002. Ms. Eyre.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Speaker, I rise today to move a second reading of the Constitutional Questions Amendment Act 2022, which requires that notice be given to the Attorney General where a constitutional challenge is made before a court or tribunal. This gives the province the opportunity to hear and defend its legislation where there's a risk it will be struck down. A provincial law may also be found to be inoperable pursuant to Section 52 of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code 2018 on the basis that it violates a section of the code. Currently, there is no requirement to notify the Attorney General when this occurs. The result is that a provincial law may be found to be inoperable without the Attorney General ever being given the opportunity to make representations. Mr. Speaker, it is essential that notice and standing be given to the Attorney General for Saskatchewan if a provincial law may be rendered inoperable. This legislation will ensure that this occurs. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading of the Constitutional Questions Amendment Act 2022.
It has been moved that Bill 101 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be on my feet to provide initial comments on behalf of the official opposition when it comes to Bill number 102, the Constitutional Questions Amendment Act 2022. I myself was quite surprised to learn that we don't have existing legislation that will require notice to be served on the Attorney General when constitutional challenges to provincial law are being brought or challenges to laws on the basis of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. Of course, the Attorney General should have standing at those proceedings and be able to make representations on the constitutionality of provincial laws, as well as whether they are consistent with human rights legislation. So obviously this particular piece of legislation makes good sense. And it was an obvious and pretty gaping gap in our legislation up to this point. So I don't have much more to say on this bill at this time, but I trust that my colleagues will weigh in to cover anything that I've missed in the coming days and weeks as we go through adjourned debates on this bill. So with that, I'm pleased to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 102, the Constitutional Questions Amendment Act 2022.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It's pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders second readings. Item number 1. Bill number 101, the Child and Family Services Amendment Act 2022. Mr. Makowski.
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move that the Child and Family Services Amendment Act 2022 be read now a second time. This bill, if passed, will improve services for the children, youth and families we serve. Mr. Speaker, renewing our province's child welfare legislation will strengthen and better recognize the importance of family, cultural and community connections for children and youth in care. In the spring of 2022, we engaged with the sector, including youth with lived experience, on what the amended act should look like. I'm pleased to provide some of the highlights in this proposed legislation. There are three main areas the government of Saskatchewan is focusing on with these amendments. The first one is raising the legal age of the child from up to 16 years of age to up to 18 years of age. This will enhance supports and services to allow youth to be supported through either voluntary or protective pathways based on the youth's needs. A policy framework will be established to emphasize outcomes that address the best interests of the child, and including youth in this work, as well as in case planning, will be imperative. The second area of focus focuses on increasing the flexibility of information sharing, disclosure and confidentiality in the best interest of the child or former child in care who is now an adult. We're expanding the scope of disclosure to children in care or to adults who are formerly children, including family name information about parents, siblings, extended family members, and extended family care providers or Indigenous authority. Personal information about these individuals that is not directly related to the child or former child in care will not be disclosed. Providing increased information about reasons for removal, relevant court matters, time in care, cultural planning, and community connections may also be included. These amendments will ensure the child's right to know their identity and familiar background, and will allow the child or former child in care to identify and establish familiar and community connections if they wish. We're also expanding information disclosure regarding deceased individuals to provide information that helps family members understand the personal circumstances of the deceased. The ministry recognizes the importance of this information to support family and personal healing. The third area of focus is strengthening language that enhances family, community, and cultural connections for children and youth. The enhancements embed the significance of family, culture, community, culturally based care and inclusion with planning with Indigenous children. This legal framework will strengthen current practice. It also addresses the importance of involving the Indigenous group, community, or people to which the child belongs in planning for Indigenous children and families. A new addition to the best interest of the child provision recognizes the unique cultural aspects of Indigenous children and requires a preservation of the child's Indigenous identity, experience, and connections be considered in planning. We're clarifying criteria to extend temporary wardship orders to increase flexibility when needed, as we acknowledge not all families have access to the unique resources they may require to make an impactful change within the current 24-month time frame. Mr. Speaker, as we move forward with updating the Child and Family Services regulations and policy framework, we will continue to engage youth with lived experience and our Indigenous partners. Their voice is important. Our government will also continue to engage with the child welfare sector partners and the advocate for children and youth on this work. Mr. Speaker, the proposed amendments outlined today are a demonstration of government's commitment to improve the lives of vulnerable families, children, and youth who receive child welfare services in our province. I now move the second reading of the Child and Family Services Amendment Act 2022.
It has been moved that Bill number 102 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. I recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be on my feet to provide initial comments on Bill 101, the Child and Family Services Amendment Act. My comments will be a little lengthier on this bill today, Mr. Speaker. It's an important piece of legislation, and I've only had a day to look at it, Mr. Speaker, so I will definitely have more to say on the bill in committee as the critic. And I did just want to take a moment to sort of say that I do think it's a shame that we no longer have the process of technical briefings on pieces of legislation like this. I would have certainly benefited from a technical briefing on this piece of legislation, particularly as it relates to child protection matters in Saskatchewan, which is so important to so many families across this province, Mr. Speaker, and particularly as this is really an area where we see a crisis situation in our province, Mr. Speaker. We have a growing number of children dying in care. We have growing incidents of serious injury and death. I don't have the 2021 numbers in front of me, but certainly in 2020, that was the case by a long shot. Those numbers are only moving in the wrong direction, as well as the overrepresentation of Indigenous families in care, Mr. Speaker. So we really do need all hands on deck when addressing the issue of child welfare in Saskatchewan. And so, as the critic, I'm disappointed that there wasn't more put in place to ensure that we come at this from a starting point of understanding. That said, I have done a significant amount of work over the last 24 hours to at least glean as much as I could from this bill, Mr. Speaker. And although there's no mention from the Minister of Bill C-92, the federal bill to do with child welfare legislation, I'm sure that this is in some respects the province's answer to Bill C-92, which was introduced as a response to the TRC calls to action, which called on the federal government to enact child welfare legislation. But I want to remind this government that we have provincial duties under the TRC calls to action as well, and we have a duty to reduce the number of Indigenous children in care, and as well this duty to address the lack of cultural connection and family connection, which we do see with this legislation an attempt to do that, Mr. Speaker, and I wouldn't want to take away from that. But my comments will be really focused on whether this bill goes far enough and where this bill has missed an opportunity to bring about some of the legislative changes that we really need in this area, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I want to just start with the sorry, before I go into the details of the bill, I do also want to touch on something I see also as a crisis in the staffing of the ministry, Mr. Speaker. None of the good work that we have to do in this area can be done if we don't sufficiently resource the Ministry of Social Services. So we can legislate all we want, and if the folks on the ground don't have the tools to do their jobs, then we won't move forward at all, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the staff of the Ministry of Social Services increasingly feel like they don't have the tools to do their job. Many of them reach out to me, and I also would note that there was a briefing note released by the SGU, the union that represents frontline Ministry of Social Services workers, that talks about the fact that they don't have what they need to be doing their job. And I'm just going to quote read a few quotes from that report. Gone is the day where we had quality over quantity. We're not giving quality work to the clients. I need to get out of there. Quote, child protection workers are overworked. Their caseloads are so high, workers can't manage them. I'm not doing any child justice, end quote. Another quote, Mr. Speaker, there's so much to be done and we're so worn thin. There's so much that could be done, but that can't be done just with the staffing and the utilities we're given. Mr. Speaker, another quote, "They need to reduce caseloads. They need to hire more staff. I can't even describe how burnt out and overworked those social workers are. You can't meet your deadlines, but they don't want you to work overtime. There's no way you can get everything done in that amount of time. The government needs to either hire more staff or approve overtime and pay those people the job they're doing." So I did want to start there, Mr. Speaker, because when I talk about the ways that we're failing children in Saskatchewan through the child welfare system, I certainly don't put that at the feet of frontline staff. They are doing what they can with not enough support, Mr. Speaker. And I also just want to note that how high the stakes are. And I think of Angela Severite and her daughter, Stelena Severite, who was a young girl that passed away in ministry care just earlier this year. She was that incident is under investigation, so I don't want to say a lot. But she was a bright young lady who was dealing with a lot of challenges, and her mother, Angela, went to the ministry because she was at her wit's end. And at first blush, certainly looking at the details of that case, the ministry provided a level of care that would have probably entitled it to apprehend that child from a parent if that child was in their parent's care. So something has to change. And of course, Stelena paid the ultimate price. Stelena is no longer with us, Mr. Speaker. So having really touched on the importance of this legislation, I will also note the minister spoke to some of the consultations that were done in bringing this legislation here. You know, I know that there are several individuals that were consulted from Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan in the development of C-92, and I know for a fact that they weren't consulted when it comes to this piece of legislation, and that is a shame, Mr. Speaker. That is, there is simply no excuse for not consulting those actors when bringing changes to legislation that is as impactful as child welfare legislation. Turning to the bill, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the change to the definition of a child and moving that up from 16 to 18 years of age, this was indeed a much-needed change. For folks who may not be aware, prior to that change, there wasn't really any legal authority to provide supports to many youth between the ages of 16 and 18 because the way that the legislation was structured. So this is a welcome change. What would often happen if you might see an individual on a long-term placement or a placement with a person of sufficient interest, and that situation might break down. And under the legislation as it currently appears, short of that person agreeing to a Section 10, they'd really be in limbo status, and the court wouldn't really have the legal authority to make a finding with respect to them. And the ministry didn't have the legal authority to provide supports to that individual. So I'm very pleased to see this change. In terms of the change that we see in terms of the best interest of the child, under Section 4, it appears to establish and codify some principles that we already see very much in action, Mr. Speaker, particularly with respect to subsection 2, which now directly expresses the importance of that cultural connection in really assessing the best interests of the child when it relates to Indigenous children. The Section 4 also restates the fact that the best interest of the child is the primary consideration with respect to any decision that's being made with respect to any child in ministry care. And of course, this is or should always have been the approach of all the actors up until now, but it is good to see this codified, Mr. Speaker. Section 24 has been amended to provide 3 days' notice to chiefs, to agencies, and to nations with respect to temporary orders, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that One Nation did challenge the practice of failing to formally notify chiefs and agencies when it came to temporary orders. a couple of years ago, and I think that practice had very much changed. Many of those actors were getting formal notice and disclosure, but again, it's good to see this codified. This was certainly a gap in the previous legislation. You know, we saw disclosure and notice formally with respect to long-term placements, but we weren't seeing it as much with temporary placements, and of course. You know, once a temporary order is made with respect to a child, that really sets many things in motion, Mr. Speaker. So it often also reverses burdens of proof. So it's very key to see early involvement from First Nations, from chiefs, from agencies. So I'm also pleased to see that particular provision. My one concern there is the 3 days. I'm not sure if that's enough time. I know that a lot of these cases are time sensitive, especially with respect to the temporary orders, Mr. Speaker, but 3 days does seem rather short. So I will be doing some consultation with chiefs and agencies to see if that 3 days is manageable in their view. And of course, timeframes are always an issue when you're dealing with child protection issues. I will have more to say later in my comments, but it's good to see with this provision that we formally provided for notice and disclosure for agencies, chiefs, and nations, that they have a formal voice at the earliest possible stage, Mr. Speaker. The next section I want to speak to is Section 38, the amendment to Section 38. Here, the ministry's policy is to seek, as we know, permanent or long-term orders. When a child has been in a period of care for between 18 and 24 months, they start to look to those long-term options, Mr. Speaker. One of my long-standing concerns is that period of kind of an apprehended status where no formal order has been made might be used to populate that 18 to 24 months, for lack of a better term, even though that shouldn't be counted, because often there are delays that sort of provide for that delay that are out of control of the family or the parent or the child, for that matter. So that should not accrue as part of that 18 to 24 months. But I have taken a closer look at this, and I don't see that this legislation appears to open the door to that, which I'm pleased to see. The change at issue here doesn't seem to be that significant, except to add additional criteria so that the court can consider additional criteria like circumstances that led to the need for protection having improved through active case planning with parents, guardians, or other folks, or if the ministry is anticipating a return of children. So in general, these changes, again, are welcome, Mr. Speaker. They do make sense and are likely a codification of what is happening and what is needed on the ground. So I do support the changes under that section. Jumping now to Section 53 of the original Act, namely here the priority placement. They've codified when there are residential services being arranged for children, so another way of saying where to place children when they're taken into ministry care, there's now a codified list of placement priorities, with the first listed priority being, the one that should be looked to first, and so on. And here we see, sorry, Mr. Speaker, I'm just bringing up that provision. Here we see that the first priority will be placing the child with one's parent, followed by placing the child with a member of the child's extended family, and finally placing the child in an environment that is consistent with the child's cultural background. So again, we see attention being paid to that familial and cultural connection, which of course we welcome on this side. I do wonder why a few things with that first reference to parents. I do wonder if there is perhaps an oversight here in terms of giving priority to a family member that has been caring for the child. So we see a lot of situations where maybe a cookum or a mushum was really quite involved in a child's life, and should they be given kind of a heightened priority after the parent but before extended family? Like the criteria there doesn't really provide for to take into consideration that pre-existing relationship, but maybe I'm being scrutinizing maybe a little bit too much here, Mr. Speaker, but it is something that occurred to me in reading through the Act. The other gap I see here is the lack of codification of the need to keep siblings together. Now, it is a practice of the ministry. They say, and often they do, try to keep siblings together, and there are resource constraints that often see siblings, separated. And I've seen a lot of heartbreaking situations, Mr. Speaker, where siblings are separated, and it's mainly due to resource constraints. And I would really like to see a codification of the priority of and the necessity of placing siblings together, barring some extraordinary circumstance, because I don't think unless I wouldn't like to see something like that left to interpretation. I'd really like to see that strengthened in legislation, Mr. Speaker. Moving on to Section 68. Whereas before an agreement could not extend beyond the 18th birthday of an individual, the colloquial term is aging out, Mr. Speaker. That is no longer the case, and we absolutely welcome this change. And obviously we'll be watching very closely to see how those regulations are developed that deal with when and under what circumstances children aging out of care can be better supported. The failure to deal with this particular gap in this legislation sooner is one of the Sask Party's government's significant failings in this area, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker. You know, this has been on their radar for a while. I can think of a piece of casework that the member from Regina University and myself brought to the previous Minister of Social Services, and I will let her perhaps speak to that more in her comments later on. But this has been a thorn in the side of many youth in Saskatchewan across the province, and we've known about this issue for a long time, and I would have liked to see this change come sooner, but obviously we do welcome it, and we will be paying close attention to ensure that the regulations get this right. Finally, well, not quite finally, but turning now to Section 70 for the confidentiality provisions, the minister spoke in his introductory remarks about the three main areas that this legislation addresses, and one of those main areas is information sharing and disclosure of information. Absolutely, the practices around information sharing have been a huge concern to the community-based organizations that are working with the ministry. I've heard so many concerns about, for example, agencies running group home settings and not getting, they get the child, but they don't get really pertinent and information relating to that child, and of course that puts children often at risk because of course you know, there are very unique considerations with each child, and when that information doesn't make it to the folks that need it, bad things happen, and bad things have happened, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the particulars of the changes here, it is something I want to take a closer look at and touch on and explore in committee. But certainly the information sharing, I do want to speak to this because certainly the Saskatchewan Information and Privacy Commissioner has identified huge gaps in the Child and Family Services legislation, which was most recently summarized in Report 269-2021. This was involving a Métis woman who was seeking information about her deceased mother from the Ministry of Social Services. Her mother had been sent to Marymount in Winnipeg, which was a boarding school for quote-unquote delinquent girls. I think it was for delinquent girls anyway, Mr. Speaker, but it was a residential school of sorts, and without disclosing, you know, private information about this individual who has spoken out, not under her name, but she has spoken out about her experience with the ministry. Her mother is now deceased, but of course that experience that her mother had at Marymount and the fallout from that shaped her family so much. It shaped her mother's ability to care for her children. It shaped all of the intergenerational relations that came after, Mr. Speaker. And this individual has the wisdom to recognize that this is something that has really shaped her family, and so she endeavored to seek out more information about what actually happened to her mother, how her mother found herself in ministry care, found herself at Marymount, and she made a request to the ministry and received a blanket no in terms of accessing any of that information. That the minister basically just said that they didn't. The minister currently, under the current legislation, does have the ability to disclose information like that when the benefits outweigh the cost. There's no additional guidance for the minister in how they assess the benefits versus the cost. You know, I just want to read from this individual. This individual's letter was reproduced in the Privacy Commissioner's report. This is Report 269/2021. She found herself at loose ends. She received this blanket denial from the ministry, and so she took her concerns to the Privacy Commissioner. And this is paragraph 13 of the Commissioner's decision. Which is quoting this individual. The reason I would like your independent review is because I have received a blanket denial with very few options or clarification as to why the minister considered the benefit of disclosure would not outweigh the invasion of privacy. My parent has passed, and more than likely, many of the people involved at that time are gone as well. I don't know what is in my parent's file, but parents' time at this school shaped my parent and my family deeply. Social Services states the benefit of confidentiality must outweigh the benefit of sharing information, and that based on this consideration, the release was denied. My question is, benefits who? My deceased parent, my grandparents, the social worker my parents said made advances on her, or does it benefit the ministry itself because the manner may have placed? I feel they hold all the power, and there is no checks and balances regarding this denial for access to information. Lastly, there is no truth and reconciliation without truth. I submitted my request for information on September 30th, 2021, the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This was by no means a coincidence. I just finally want to know the truth around this matter because it affected my parent, me, and our family. Therefore, I feel it is our truth and our story to understand. Any assistance you can offer is greatly appreciated. So, obviously, this goes to truth and reconciliation, Mr. Speaker. There are many individuals across the province that want to access their records, their ministry records that have to do with residential schools, that have to do with 60 Scoop, Mr. Speaker, and they have very few options for doing that. And, you know, I hear the minister in saying that these legislative changes are an attempt to address this gap, but I will be taking a closer look at whether it in fact does what the minister says it's going to do, because I do have some initial flags, certainly. Because one of the things that the Commissioner suggested and recommended in his report, Mr. Speaker, is that Section 23(3) of the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act, Mr. Speaker, that 23(3)(c) remove this section altogether, so that the privacy framework that exists can operate as it relates to child and family services records, Mr. Speaker. So off the hop, we're seeing no amendment to FOIP as part of that legislation, and so I am concerned about that, Mr. Speaker, and it's something that I will look more into, because we know that child and family services records are subject to review by information privacy commissioners and the accompanying legislation in other jurisdictions like Alberta, BC, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Mr. Speaker. So I do think that that is a change that we need to see here in Saskatchewan. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, that I want to take a closer look at this is the failure to provide that the minister, in making their assessment about whether to release records, isn't required to produce written reasons. I think that that would be important. And again, I did not get a technical briefing on this legislation, but based on my initial review of the Act, it doesn't require the minister to provide written reasons for their decisions. That is important, Mr. Speaker, because then we can assess that decision objectively according to criteria in a transparent and independent way. I'm almost done here, Mr. Speaker. I just want to touch on a few things that I feel that this Act off the hop misses. Although this is an attempt to obviously address the lack of family and cultural community in the current legislation, and it's something of an answer to Bill C-92, there are some oversights here. We don't see any wording as it relates to permanent orders under Section 37, Mr. Speaker. When a permanent order is made by a court, that severs all of a child's ties to their family. The court cannot cannot attach any conditions to a permanent order. And there may be a constitutional issue. There are constitutional challenges winding their way through the courts across the country on this issue as we speak. And it's something of a shame that we missed an opportunity here to provide for courts to attach conditions to permanent orders to ensure that cultural connectivity, that connection to family and culture, because right now we don't have a mechanism to do that for permanent orders. Mr. Speaker, timeframes remain a huge issue. Of course, we have a system of warrantless apprehension of children. In Canada, if you want to arrest someone, if you want to search them, you often have to get a warrant. If the ministry wants to apprehend a child, they do so at their discretion. So there has to be some checks and balances. Once that child is apprehended, it would be good to see some strict timelines in terms of judicial oversight of those apprehensions, Mr. Speaker. One other thing that I want to touch on, Mr. Speaker, the ministry has the power to, in this ability to apprehend and place children and then to move on. They have the power to relocate children and change status of quo in a family law context, Mr. Speaker, without the oversight of courts. So that is another thing that I will be looking at more closely with this legislation. It may be something of a missed opportunity, the failure to provide for any adjudication when the ministry has this power to basically unilaterally change the status quo, which of course has legal implications in the family law context. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will wrap up my initial comments on Bill number 101, the Child and Family Services Amendment Act. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on this bill as we engage in further debate. So with that, I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 101.
Hear, hear. Well done. The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 88, the Saskatchewan First Act. Ms. Bowen.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be fairly brief with my comments on Bill number 88, the Saskatchewan First Act today. I have had a look at the legislation and listened to comments from members on both sides, and you know, my understanding is that with 3 main parts here in the Act, that much of this Act really focuses on reasserting Saskatchewan's exclusive jurisdiction over things like exploration, development, and management of natural resources, forestry, power generation, fertilizer use, and I think that we've heard a lot of comments in here and throughout the media that this really doesn't do anything to change the jurisdiction that we have as a province, and so I think that there's a lot of questions about why this process is playing out the way that it is, coming from the Sask Party government, and I think therein lies the answer. This is a process that, to me, has seemed to be very partisan, politically driven. You know, putting politics ahead of delivering results for the people of Saskatchewan, and I think that we see that even in the third part, or third kind of main aspect of this piece of legislation that establishes a tribunal. And a lot of my questions are here for what this tribunal will look like, but I do want to note and put on the record that we have a tribunal coming out of a manifesto, and it sounds a little bit like Dwight Schrute from The Office is advising this government on their language. Couple laughs in the back row. That's good. You know, but the process throughout has been strange and has been very, very partisan from the beginning in a way that has raised a lot of concerns around Saskatchewan and across Canada. It's a process that I think has raised a lot of questions about the end product in this act. In particular, an autonomy tour that was marked by closed-door meetings arranged by a known separatist. This wasn't a transparent process of taking in perspectives of valued stakeholders. This is a closed-door autonomy tour from the beginning, and it just brings up the question, who was invited to take part in that consultation and who was left out? Well, and here's what we know who was left out. Indigenous people were left out. First Nations leaders, Métis leaders were left out of that process, and so I have a lot of concerns about a government that is ignoring their responsibilities in treaty. The other part of this process that raises questions is the white paper, and it's been described as 2 + 2 equals whatever you want it to equal. And this is the kind of math that wouldn't hold up in any school in Saskatchewan. Let me back up, it wouldn't hold up in any public or Catholic school in Saskatchewan. And it's full of sentences and paragraphs whose structure wouldn't meet expectations in most high school English language arts classes. It's been panned thoroughly in the media. I think it's fair to say it's been ridiculed and made fun of. And unfortunately, this government has put themselves in a position where much of the process over this legislation has harmed our reputation here and abroad. So that is disappointing to see, Mr. Speaker, but at the end of the day, I think Saskatchewan needs to take an all of the above approach when it comes to energy development and ensuring our prosperity into the future. And I will note that if this government was serious about that, if they were serious about delivering, instead of just playing politics with this, that they would renew the equalization lawsuit that the Sask Party government dropped once their Conservative leader came to power in Ottawa years ago. With that, there's been a lot of talk about tummy tickling, and I don't know the exact quote, so I won't go after it, but the tummy tickling is what we're talking about here. But apparently they're not interested in that. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks, and I'll move that we adjourn debate on Bill 88, the Saskatchewan First Act. Thank you.
Thank you. The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading of motion for Bill number 90, the Telecommunications Statute Borrowing Powers Amendment Act 2022. Mr. Love.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise today and enter into the debate on Bill number 90, the Telecommunications Statutes Borrowing Powers Amendment Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, this bill does several things. I know my colleagues have had the opportunity to speak about this a little bit already. It increases the borrowing limit of SaskTel from $1.8 billion to $2.9 billion. And the rationale as government's providing it is that they're saying that SaskTel needs to borrow this money as it grows to invest in infrastructure, which will provide sufficient room for the foreseeable future. Mr. Speaker, I think my colleague, the member from Rosemont, the critic for this bill, spoke very eloquently in his ministerial statement this afternoon about the importance of SaskTel and the work that they do, the service that they provide to Saskatchewan, and the importance of our crowns, generally speaking. Mr. Speaker, I think most Saskatchewan residents can say, I don't know about all the folks on the other side, but most Saskatchewan residents understand and appreciate the value of our crowns. Truly, if, for example, Rogers or TELUS were the only game in town in Saskatchewan, it's not likely that some of the communities that we see have service, internet and cell service would have it, Mr. Speaker. And I think we all know, I think we knew it before the pandemic, but the pandemic showed the importance of connectivity and what will happen when folks don't have access to these services. my colleague, the member from Rosemont, spoke well about the challenges that many communities in Saskatchewan still face in connectivity. And Mr. Speaker, of course, there's much more work to be done. There's updates to the infrastructure that's of course needed moving forward, ensuring that SaskTel remains the strong company that it is. Mr. Speaker, I know Mr. Speaker, the bill is actually fairly short and small in length, Mr. Speaker, but we're talking about billions of dollars, which is very important. Which is very important, Mr. Speaker. So it's important that when we're talking about so much money, that's done with scrutiny. Okay. Terry's good. And I know my colleague, the member from Rosemont, will be scrutinizing this piece of legislation closely and asking officials the important questions at committee. In order to allow my colleague to do that good work, I am prepared now to allow this bill to move on to its next stage.
The question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 90 be read a second time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize the Government House Leader.
To the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 94, the Public Pension and Benefits Administration Corporation Act. Ms. Bowes.
Recognize member from Regina University.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to enter remarks onto the record on Bill number 94, the Public Pensions and Benefits Administration Corporation Act. Mr. Speaker, all members in this Assembly are members of a PEP, a great pension plan, and we're all proud of its history as well as how well it performs and is managed. Mr. Speaker, some other members on this side have canvassed some of the intent of this legislation, and I'd like to just briefly put a couple comments on the record in regards to the consultation that has and hasn't taken place. And I do want to make sure, with such an important change, especially one that for many pension members has been greeted with some hesitation, given the history of attempts to privatize this pension plan under the Devine government, that consultation has taken place on this bill and on the significant change in governance and administration for the 100,000 or so retired public servants who are members of this and served by PIBA. There are questions out there about consultation. I know my office has received communications from retired public servants who do not feel that they were consulted and were caught unaware by this change, Mr. Speaker, especially with the announcement coming out on, I believe it was the Friday afternoon of the May long weekend, the last day that session wrapped. And, through discussions with officials, I think it's safe to say, Mr. Speaker, that there is some cautious optimism, but that consultation piece and true transparency is critical, as this is an essential plan for so many members in this province, Mr. Speaker. There's also some questions specifically about some of the reports, especially the MNP Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval report that was entitled Steady, Trusted and Future Ready, the case for the Public Employee Benefit Agency as a non-profit corporation to empower members. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know through discussions with the experts that this was the path chosen to achieve the outcomes sought by administrators. However, this was not the only opportunity that they had for administrative and governance changes, and explaining the rationale as to why this was chosen will be critical. Are some key questions, and I'd like to just highlight one for the record, Mr. Speaker, in regards to the comment, which I believe is on page 15,
which lists a summary of key benefits for a diverse range of key stakeholders, and it's noted that this change will remove the government forever remove the government for any responsibility for adverse events, and there's no adverse events specified in this, Mr. Speaker, nor defined. I think some clarification around these comments, as well as what risks are being mitigated and at what cost to whom, would go a long way to setting aside any concerns that the 100,000 retirees may have when they read that part of the MNP report. You know, I'd note somewhat glibly, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, that while it may be nothing to be concerned about, it is noteworthy, especially considering the definition of adverse events and what may be mitigated therein is nowhere else discussed in the report. Reducing the risk of liability, again on page 15, is one of the benefits to the government of Saskatchewan, with the benefits to the 100,000 retirees of this plan, again, not clearly defined. You know, there's also questions in terms of liability in regards to operating expenses and questions of government, you know, government oversight, as well as the ongoing regulation and governance of this plan. But, Mr. Speaker, I know my colleagues will have other comments to put on the record, and the critic will do this good justice in committee. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate on Bill number 94.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 95, the Surface Rights Acquisition and Compensation Amendment Act 2022. Mr. Love.
I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise today and enter into the debate on Bill number 95, the Surface Rights Acquisition and Compensation Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill provides a time frame for landowners to complain to the board and operator if they have an objection and call for a hearing. It also does several other things requiring that the board, including that the board must alert the ministry of any decision that they have. Mr. Speaker, I know that my colleague is reaching out to stakeholders about this bill and ensuring that it does the important work that it needs to do, that it's protecting the interests of landowners and operators. I know she's keen to hear from anyone who has feedback on this bill. My colleague, the member for Regina University. Mr. Speaker, from what I understand, Alberta has had similar protections for landowners for a while, so we're glad to see that Saskatchewan is catching up, if this is providing the protections that already exist in that jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, it's very important to ensure that landowners are getting paid for the land that they're leasing, Mr. Speaker. In order to allow other colleagues enter into the debate on this bill, I am going to conclude my remarks on this piece of legislation and move to adjourn debate on Bill number 95.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 96, the Leaf Cutting Beekeepers Registration Repeal Act. Ms. Bowes.
Recognize member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise and enter into the debate on Bill number 96, the Leaf Cutting Beekeepers Registration Repeal Act. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation repeals the 1992 Act that fines anyone who isn't registered from possessing any bees or beekeeping equipment. I know my former colleague, the former member for Regina Northeast, is very much an expert in this area and very passionate about the work of beekeeping, Mr. Speaker. From what I understand, Mr. Speaker, this is a fairly straightforward piece of legislation, but I do know the critic is going to be looking at this bill very closely and reaching out to stakeholders, perhaps the former member for Regina Northeast. What I can say, and I want to put on the record, is that on this side of the House, we absolutely love bees. don't love it when they sting us, but you know, they perform a really important service in the environment and make a very delicious treat, Mr. Speaker. Before I say anything more silly on the record, I think I'm prepared at this point to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 96.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 97, the Architects Amendment Act 2022. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognized member from Regina University.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today, especially with such warm support from the Minister of Health, to speak to the critical and well-drafted Bill number 97, the Architects Amendment Act 2022. Mr. Speaker, cursory reading of this bill indicates that this will allow increased issuing of architectural license to qualified individuals, as is intended by the legislation, to people or corporations in trade agreements. And, Mr. Speaker, in terms of increasing labour mobility and what we can do to recognize the credentials of qualified individuals in this province, in and outside of the architectural field, is a good thing for the future of this province. And Mr. Speaker, I would assume, which I suppose I shouldn't do on the record, that this is also in some way related to previously introduced Bill 81, which seeks to increase that labour mobility, as well as streamlining some of the credentials for qualified individuals across jurisdictions in Canada. I understand work remains ongoing on that, and myself, as well as stakeholders across industries, remain deeply interested in the progression of that work, Mr. Speaker. Not being a critic for this bill, I guess I will also say, let the record show that we on this side of the House believe architecture to be a great field full of wonderful contributions to the province of Saskatchewan. And I think it's Sask Polytech that has a wonderful diploma program in architectural technologies, a great opportunity for young people truly seeking to stay and build this great province. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll leave the more articulate comments for my colleagues and move to adjourn debate on Bill number 97, the Architects Amendment Act 2022.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 7, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 98, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Amendment Act 2022. Ms. Conway.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon, Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to stand and continue adjourned debate for Bill number 98, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Amendment Act 2022. After reviewing this bill, I can safely say that the bill, in short, makes sure that persons and municipalities at fault for an emergency liable for costs incurred by SPSA's response. And primarily, this is around wildfire damage. It also allows the minister to calculate, waive the municipality debt of the Crown. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill makes notable changes around private persons covering the emergency response costs of wildfires. I'm cautiously optimistic that this balances fairness with the individual and municipal obligations. My colleague earlier noted that in her second reading response that all too often individuals and municipalities simply may not have the resources to cover these incidents, however liable they may be. So I'm hoping that these regulations fairly outline the powers of the minister's pardoning costs to avoid a government minister that simply picks winners and losers when it comes to cost recovery. I think that while we talk about how we can distribute the cost of these act of God disasters, be it wildfires or floods, as we've seen in the past several years becoming more ferocious, I would call on the government to seriously consider ways that it can mitigate and prevent these natural disasters from happening. Ideally, the province would be seeking not just a punitive approach to wildfire cost management, but also a preventative one. Governments at all levels, be it federal, provincial, municipal, have a duty to take steps that will ensure our communities are safe and well prepared for disaster when they make strike. So I'm calling on the government to ensure not only details around who will pay for these natural disasters, but they will start taking preventative action so that these events may be less impactful in the future. People in Saskatchewan, with our immense natural beauty, sprawling prairies, amazing northern forests, deserve to have our environment protected and for the government to take action to mitigate disaster. Mr. Speaker, we still all do have a role to play in this. I was sitting in the Tim Hortons drive-through during the election. In front of me, a car threw a fully lit cigarette out the window, hitting the grass, and it just shocked me, if that had happened in any dry area of our province, where we hear the Minister of Agriculture talking about drought. If this happened in any one of those places, that, is where we see individuals having huge impact on wildfires. So, Mr. Speaker, I won't be too long on this. I would call on the government to consider ways not only to find ways of finding fault and punitive action, but to invest up front in ways to reduce costs of these crises later. Mr. Speaker, I know that the critic for this area will have more to say, and I await their response, as well as the feedback from stakeholders in this area to guide us on the best path forward. I will adjourn debate today on Bill number 98.
The member moves to adjourn debate. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 8. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 99, the Emergency 911 System Amendment Act 2022. Ms. Conway.
Recognize a member from Regina University.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege, as always, to enter some comments into the record. Currently on Bill number 99, the Emergency 911 System Amendment Act 2022. Mr. Speaker, looking at this legislation and reviewing the minister's comments, it appears to be an initiative to modernize 911 services, to accept text, photos, and video calls. And when reviewing the legislation, Mr. Speaker, my first thought was like, oh, great, this is going to bring 911 services into the 21st century for Saskatchewan. But then upon reflection, I realized I did not have a cell phone that I use regularly until 2006. So I guess bringing this truly into the 2020s. Mr. Speaker, one of the concerns with this bill, or one of the concerns surrounding some of the changes for SAS 911 is certainly the doubling of fees in 2021 for 911. Mr. Speaker, talk about inflation, doubling of fees for 911 charges during a pandemic and during the greatest inflationary crunch of a generation. Mr. Speaker, we need to ensure that fees for 911 services are reasonable, especially in this current crisis as services develop and expand, which hopefully will expand access as well as assure individuals in this province and help them feel safer and better covered with additional options to reach out to 911. But of course, we need to ensure that this is accessible and not simply another downloaded government fee or tax onto the people of this province. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I know this legislation will be well canvassed with stakeholders and by my colleague, the trustee critic. So with that, I move to adjourn debate on Bill number 99.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 9, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 100, the Miscellaneous Statute Accretion Amendment Act 2022. Ms. Conway.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Meewasin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today to throw some comments on the record for Bill number 100. Toss in some comments for the Miscellaneous Statute Accretion Amendment Act, Bill number 100. Reviewed through this bill, Mr. Speaker, and I want to quickly, so that the folks at home watching understand accretion here. This is the process of growth or increased typically by the gradual accumulation of additional layers or matter. Accretion is only recognized for the purposes of when land is fully dry. And Mr. Speaker, this is the opposite of erosion, you know, so we see this as an important aspect as we continue to see our natural landscapes change, and in a lot of ways due to a changing climate, with water changing patterns, swelling or decreasing. You see that new land becomes available. Bill 100, you know, it really talks about when natural monuments or crown land boundaries change due to this process. This bill now gives the power to the minister for determining those boundaries. The minister then is responsible for transferring, withholding that transfer of accreted land to adjacent landowners. The bill goes in to say that it applies to accretion of some subsurface mineral land parcels, so there's a resource element to this, Mr. Speaker, that I'm sure that my colleagues, the critic for agriculture and energy and resources, will have some thoughts to discuss in committee or on the record here. It also discusses how the Crown is not liable for any revenue it received from accreted land prior to this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, there's some concerns that, you know, come forward. We hope that the minister has taken the time to address this bill to stakeholders and landowners next to crown lands and natural monuments, and whether, you know, those folks feel that it's appropriate for the minister to be that final judge and jury on where these new boundaries are put forward. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before, and also in my last bill, you know, as more extreme weather events occur, it's going to be our responsibility to mark and define the changes that will occur in our landscapes and our land boundaries. I also hope, Mr. Speaker, that this government, you know, any discussion about crown lands continues to involve Indigenous leaders, you know, because we have seen some concerning actions around a duty to consult from this government with sell-off of crown lands with little to no discussion with Indigenous leaders. I also wonder if Indigenous folks were even consulted in this process, as it probably will affect many, many folks in that area. Mr. Speaker, it's an honor here today to stand and provide comments on Bill number 100. And I'm not going to take up too much more time. I'm going to adjourn debate on this bill.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. As a pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion. I recognize the Government House Leader.
I would move that this House do now adjourn.
Government House Leader has moved to adjourn the House. Is a pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House now stands adjourned till 1:30 tomorrow.